Am I the only one who was expecting the conclusion of that story to involve somebody getting shot in the dick? This is a long and meandering story that came to a climax about 12 years ago. It's one of the most bizarre things that's happened to me and left me rattled and puzzled for a long time. When I was in college, my father retired and moved to New Orleans. He had lived there in his 20s and 30s, and his two sons from his first marriage, my half-brothers, still lived there. He moved into a cool apartment complex with a swimming pool in the center courtyard and a lot of sociable people his age. One of them was a retired Army general. I'll call him Tom. My dad and Tom were the same age, and both Korean War veterans. My dad had been in the Marines for 4 years during the latter part of the war, while Tom had stayed in and risen through the ranks. Tom had been to Ranger School in the Special Forces pipeline and was a country expert for Korea. He was in Korea for most of the Cold War, training ROK Marines, gaming out World War III scenarios, and working closely with a large private corporation, I'll not name here, doing semi-spook stuff. He retired shortly before September 11th. He was a full colonel at the time and was promoted to brigadier general, 1 star, just before retirement to sweeten his pension. That was kind of a professional courtesy, old boy club thing. After September 11th, the government expanded the Federal Air Marshal Service and asked Tom to come out of retirement lead the restructuring. They wanted someone who didn't have apparent command, and since he had been out of the Army for a year or so, he was a good candidate. They promoted him to Major General, 2 star, so that he would have clout among the other generals, GS-15 civilian employees, and private sector executives he'd be working with. Colin Powell pinned his 2nd star on him personally in the White House. At this time, I was in the Marine Reserve myself and getting ready to graduate college. I'd not yet been called up for OIF or OEF, so I was looking for my first grown-up job. My dad suggested that being an air marshal could be fun for a year or two, even if it wasn't exactly something I was interested in. I had a clearance and was an expert on the range, not mention I was a friend of the 2 star who was running the program, so I was maybe a step ahead of some of the other candidates. My dad arranged a phone call with Tom to talk about my options. At this point, I'd met Tom many times when I'd go to visit my dad. He was one of the kindest men I've known. We'd sit around the pool, and I would pick his brain endlessly about his military experience and the spooky adventures he was at liberty to talk about. As a young enlisted Marine, it's hard to describe the feeling of being close with a 2 star general. I had seen a general maybe 3 times at that point. If you're a lance corporal in a rifle platoon and a major shows up in the barracks, you snap to attention and bark out, "Attention on deck," like it was Darth Vader walking in the room. Somebody with stars on their collar might just give you a heart attack right there. So to be shooting the shit with Tom was pretty special for me. Tom was a widower and an old Southern gentleman, and dated women here and there. Although he didn't smoke, he always carried a Zippo lighter with him to light a lady's cigarette. He lit a cigarette for me by the pool one day, and I noted that his Zippo had a Ranger crest on it. He said that his daughter had given it to him years before, and he thought it was gaudy at the time. He wasn't the type to advertise his status, but he came to cherish it after his daughter died. She had been an avid equestrian and had died in a car accident in Costa Rica in the 70s or early 80s while she was down there for some kind of riding event. His wife died of cancer some years later. Tom's apartment was covered in photos of his daughter in riding gear. She was beautiful. The dated feel of the portraits, frozen in the 1970s, the quiet apartment, and Tom's outward sanguinity were all horribly tragic. At any rate, we spoke on the phone about the Air Marshal program. He couldn't answer a lot of my questions due to operational security, but we talked for about an hour. In the end, another job came up, and I didn't opt for the Air Marshal program. Still, my dad would give me regular updates whenever Tom would go back to New Orleans on leave. Once Tom told my father that they'd done computer simulations of a terrorist running up an airplane aisle, and the only part that stayed relatively motionless was the groin. Obviously, in an airplane, you want to hit the target and not the fuselage, so they decided to aim for the groin as part of their doctrine. My dad was a physician and told Tom that there would be a tremendous amount of bleeding, and that would be a problem if they wanted to take anyone alive. Being a curious man, my dad set about coming up with a solution to this in his free time. He sketched out a sort of jock strap with a hemostatic agent where the cup would be and gave it to Tom. And Tom came back to him some months later and said that a prominent pharmaceutical company was making a prototype. My dad didn't want money or credit. He was just happy to have been involved in solving a small problem for his country. After the Iraq invasion, Tom left the Air Marshal program and worked on Condoleezza Rice's staff as a national security aide. All in all, everyone loved Tom. He and my dad became very good friends in a few short years. Tom took my brother's kids to Saints games. They lived in family neighborhoods where everyone was always sitting on the porch and visiting with each other in the summer. Tom would swing by some evenings, and my niece and nephew and all the neighborhood kids would come running, yelling, "Mr. Tom," as they do in the South. I was mobilized in 2004, and my father died shortly before I deployed to Iraq. I went to New Orleans on emergency leave, and my brothers, their wives, my sister, my girlfriend, and I drove to Grand Isle, Louisiana to scatter his ashes in the Gulf. Tom wore his full dress uniform. After the ashes were in the water, Tom removed his white gloves and threw them in as well. I'd not known this tradition before, but I was touched by it. He choked back tears and had a lump in his voice. Later, he took my sister and me to an expensive dinner at one of the finest restaurants in New Orleans and told us he was always there for us. Anything we needed, anytime. I fell out of touch with Tom after deploying and coming home. When Katrina hit, I called my sister-in-law Maggie to see if everyone was okay. I asked about Tom and she said, "Oh my God, you didn't hear about Mr. Tom?" I tensed up and said, "No, what happened?" What she said settled over me slowly like slime. Maggie's neighborhood was underwater and she, my brother, and her kids went to a friend's house on high ground. There were a dozen others there in the same situation. One of them was Tom's older sister, who would have been in her 80s. She and Maggie knew each other by name and reputation, but had not met until then. Maggie introduced herself and asked after Tom. His sister was worried, as she'd not heard from him since the storm. Maggie said, "Well, I wouldn't worry. I bet the government has a list of VIPs to check on, and Mr. Tom is surely on it." Tom's sister said, "Maggie, I don't know what Tom has told you, but not a general, not a ranger, no air marshal program, no Condoleezza Rice, no Colin Powell, no bleeding out through the groin problem for my dad to waste his time solving. No nothing. Tom was in fact a penny ante lawyer. What was true was that Tom's sister's deceased husband was a Korea vet, a ranger, a high ranker, and a spook. Tom grew up admiring everything about his brother-in-law. At some point, Tom's dreary real-life lawyer job faded from his reality, and his fantasies replaced them. The truly sick and disturbing thing was that his daughter and ex-wife were very much alive. They'd just written him off when his detachment became too much, so he killed them off in his narrative. Still, his daughter had the heart to take him in after Katrina destroyed the apartment building. We found out later. My girlfriend watched my face collapse as I talked to Maggie, and she was equally devastated when I told her after I got off the phone. I had so many questions. What if I had followed up on the air marshal thing and said, "Hey, Mr. Tom sent me"? Then some of the particulars hit me. He said he was only promoted to the general ranks after retirement, so he would have had an answer as to why he wasn't listed in the Army website's general officer biographies. He probably had an answer to the air marshal thing too. It's like writing a screenplay, coming up with plausible explanations for kinks in the story or character development. Maggie ran into him a couple months after Katrina. He was all smiles and Maggie said, "Stop. Your sister told me everything." He just laughed and said, "Oh, that old bat's crazy." That was the last any of us ever heard of him. I've Googled him, but not found anything. I'm just glad my father passed away not knowing the truth. He would have been bereft and possibly would have beat the shit out of him. I'm saddened by my dead father having been played like a fool in his last years, but I'm also sad for Tom. The gloves in the water and all that were bullshit, but his tears weren't. Nor his graciousness at dinner with my sister and me. With the life in Washington, D.C. being phony and his relatives having written him off, my dad and our family were really the closest people he had in his life. This is the most unbelievable one. It's a completely mind-blowing, yet tragic story. You can't make this up. I feel for Tom, who probably couldn't cope with how disappointed he was at his own life, to the point he chose to detach himself from reality and meticulously create a way to fake a new, more exciting one. He was prepared to have an explanation to everything, to the point no one outside of his family could even suspect he was faking. In a sense, he truly lost his wife and daughter in the way. I hope you're okay. Finding out that a man you respected and who was important not only to you, but to your passed away father must have been shocking, disturbing, and sad. Who else was expecting Tom to ask for tree fitty at the end? For a second there, I thought Tom would end up being a giant prehistoric crustacean from Paleozoic era. And now that you broke the sob truth, I actually wish he was. Damn, this made me feel sick. There's something about this story that feels so unsettling. How can a person be this delusional? To keep on living a lie, literally, and to lie in the faces of people whom he likes and probably trusts? Wow. I went through this with a friend of my father's, but nothing this deep. How despicable.